When I finally, calmly, systematically took a look at what transitive and intransitive verbs actually are, I came to this conclusion. The terms transitive and intransitive have absolutely zero relation to reality. In the real world, intransitive verbs aren't really a thing. The Spanish authority tells us when a clause or sentence contains a direct object, the verb in that clause or sentence is transitive. Then they tell us when a clause or sentence doesn't contain a direct object, the verb in that clause or sentence is intransitive. So, according to them, when there's a direct object, the verb is transitive, and when there's not a direct object, the verb is intransitive. But in reality, there's always a direct object. On planet Earth, when some action is performed, when a verb is done, somebody or something has to do that verb, the subject. And when any verb is done, somebody or something has to get that verb done to them, or to it, the direct object. So, the subject does the verb, and the direct object gets the verb done to it. Jimmy speaks Spanish. The subject is Jimmy, he does the speaking, the verb is speaks, the direct object is Spanish, that's what gets spoken. The subject does the verb to the direct object, Jimmy speaks Spanish. In reality, that's how it always goes. Once there's a verb, there has to be a subject and there has to be a direct object. Spanish can't be spoken by nobody, can it? Somebody or something has to speak it. There has to be a subject. And Jimmy can't speak nothing. That's not how speaking works. When Jimmy speaks, he has to speak or say something. There has to be a direct object. I'm not saying this is some rule or law. After looking at hundreds and hundreds of examples, if not thousands, I'm simply saying it's my observation. In reality, once there's a verb, there's always a subject and there's always a direct object. Where things get tricky is when we're just speaking normally, we often omit the subject or direct object from our sentences, or both. It's just so normal for us though, most of the time we don't even realize we're doing it. We see an example of this right away when we start learning Spanish. You know how in Spanish, if the context allows it, we can completely omit the subject? Jimmy speaks Spanish could be Jimmy habla español, but if you already know that I'm talking about Jimmy, I could just say habla español. I didn't say Jimmy, I omitted the subject. But that doesn't mean in reality there's no subject. Jimmy didn't just disappear. I'm pretty sure the laws of physics, on planet Earth at least, don't allow for that kind of thing to happen. It just means I omitted the subject. This sentence is missing its subject. Because of my normal human logic and the context, you already knew I was talking about Jimmy, I knew I didn't have to say Jimmy and you'd still know I was talking about Jimmy. Because you had the same context and you have the same normal human logic I have. Remember, context is reality and a lack of context or missing context is not reality? Well, this is a whole other kind of missing context, a more important kind of missing context, a more consequential kind. When we're learning Spanish, most of the confusing sentences are missing context. They're missing their subject, they're missing their direct object, they could even be missing their verb. Sentences with missing context confuse us because they don't match reality. Something's there in reality that isn't being accounted for in the sentence. So whenever we're confused and the sentence is missing context, our fastest path to clarity is to fill it back in. We need to identify the missing context and fill in the missing context. For example, habla español. In this sentence, the verb is habla and the direct object is español. That's what gets spoken. No subject. This sentence is missing its subject, so our job is to fill it in. I only said habla español because I knew that you knew that I was talking about Jimmy. So from the context, we know that habla español, missing subject, really means Jimmy habla español, no missing subject. When filling in missing context, our first option is to use whatever context we do have, either from a previous sentence, from a previous conversation, or from our five senses, our eyes, ears, mouth, nose, and touch. But even when we don't have any context, when we see something like habla español, we still know that's missing its subject. Not only because there's always a subject, but because Spanish can't be spoken on its own. Somebody or something has to speak it, so we just say that. Habla español, missing subject, really means alguien habla español. Somebody speaks Spanish, no missing subject. Or it could mean una persona habla español. A person speaks Spanish. Or él or ella habla español. He or she speaks Spanish. All of these statements have to be true, and there's no missing subject in any of them. When filling in missing context, when we don't have any normal context, our second option is to use what I call default context. By default, when something is told, somebody has to tell it, or a person has to tell it, or he or she has to tell it. That's the default context for this sentence. Have you ever wondered why in Spanish, when talking about the weather, they say hace frío when we say it is cold, and they say hace calor when we say it is hot? They use the verb hacer, which normally means to make or to do, while in English we use the verb to be. Why do they use hacer in this context? Makes cold, makes hot, huh? It makes itself? This is one of the most common questions I get, and until recently, I didn't have an answer. I knew this was something I had to take a closer look at, so I finally took a closer look with fresh eyes. It is cold. Hace frío. The verb is hace from hacer, and the direct object is frío. That's one big difference difference between the English and Spanish in this context. The word frío is being used as a noun here. It's el frío. That means coldness, basically. I don't see a subject. This sentence is missing its subject. And the second I filled it in with default context, I saw right away, for the first time, what was going on. I saw the logical explanation for why, when talking about the weather, they say hace frío and hace calor when we say it is cold and it is hot. What's the missing subject? Who or what is making coldness or heat? Who or what could possibly make the world cold or hot? That's when it hit me. There's only one somebody or something that can make all the air around us cold or hot. The big man upstairs, Mr. G-O-D. I'm not religious myself, but I'm pretty sure that's what's going on here. Spanish developed a long time ago when I assume most people not only believed in God, but believed that God was responsible for the weather, that God was responsible for the coldness and the heat, that God makes coldness, that God makes heat or warmth. I guess the fact that when there's coldness, God made the coldness, and when there's heat, God made the heat, back in the day, that was so so default, at some point, they stopped mentioning God every single time. Everybody knew who makes coldness and who makes heat. So now when we see hace frío and hace calor, we don't have to waste our time being confused anymore. We don't have to waste another second wondering why. Hace frío and hace calor, missing subject, really mean él hace frío and él hace calor, or Dios hace frío and Dios hace calor. And the way we got here was, we just identified the missing context and filled it in, using nothing more than our normal human logic and the default context of the situation. Plus, as my dad recently pointed out, in French, they say the same thing basically, but they don't omit the subject so it's easier to see what's going on. In French, they say il fait froid when we say it is cold, and they say il fait chaud when we say it is hot or warm, but they pronounce the words correctly. More literally, these French sentences mean it or he makes coldness, and it or he makes heat or warmth, just like in Spanish. Are you starting to see why missing context is a problem, and how filling it in is the solution? When we're confused, there's almost always missing context. So when we're confused, identifying and filling in the missing context is our fastest path to not being confused. We started talking about missing context in the first place, though, because of missing direct objects, not missing subjects. Remember the transitive-intransitive thing? I said the terms transitive and intransitive have absolutely zero relation to reality, because in reality, there's always a direct object, so intransitive verbs can't really be a thing. Say there's some drama going down with our friends Jimmy and Kimmy, and we've both known for a while that Jimmy is thinking about telling Kimmy the truth. Well, I just got off the phone with Jimmy, and I have an update for you. I could say to you, Jimmy told Kimmy the truth. The subject is Jimmy, that's who did the telling. The verb is told. The direct object is the truth, that's what got told. Then Kimmy is an indirect object, because Kimmy is who received the direct object. Kimmy received the truth. So the subject does the verb, the direct object gets the verb done to it, and the indirect object, when there is one, receives the direct object. But since you've known for a while that Jimmy was thinking about telling Kimmy the truth, I could just tell you Jimmy told Kimmy. This time I omitted the direct object. I omitted the truth. But just because I omitted the direct object from the sentence doesn't mean poof, it's gone from reality. Jimmy couldn't have told Kimmy nothing. It just means this sentence is missing its direct object. When I said Jimmy told Kimmy, my human logic told me I didn't have to say the truth. I knew you had the same human logic I have and would still know I was talking about the truth. That Jimmy told Kimmy, missing direct object, really means Jimmy told Kimmy the truth, no missing direct object. Even when we don't have any normal context though, there's always default context. If we have no clue who Jimmy and Kimmy are, when we see something like Jimmy told Kimmy, we still know that's missing its direct object, not only because there's always a direct object, but because Jimmy had to have told Kimmy something. So again, we just say that. Jimmy told Kimmy, missing direct object, really means Jimmy told Kimmy something, no missing direct object. The direct object is something. Or we could say, Jimmy told Kimmy words, no missing direct object. Now the direct object is words. Both these statements have to be true. You know how sometimes we understand all the vocab and grammar in a sentence, but still don't know who or what is doing what to whom or what? We think we have a sentence construction problem, and we do, but really we have a missing context problem. A huge percentage of the missing direct objects out there are caused by two groups of verbs that I call bodily movement verbs and existential verbs. Both groups work almost exactly the same, but they are a little different, so we'll start with bodily movement verbs. We do bodily movement verbs to ourselves, and to do them, we don't need to involve anything else or anybody else. We just need to move our bodies. So with bodily movement verbs, we're the noun that does the verb, we're the subject, and we're the noun that gets the verb done to it, we're the direct object. For example, the verb to sit is usually used as a bodily movement verb. When we sit, we just need to move our bodies. We do the verb to ourselves. When we sit ourselves. We do the sitting, we're the subject, but we also get the sitting done to us, we're the direct object. Jimmy sits in a chair. The subject is Jimmy, the verb is sits, then in a chair is called a prepositional object phrase or prepositional object. We'll talk about prepositional objects in a future video. For now, what's important is this sentence is missing its direct object, because to sit is a bodily movement verb, and with bodily movement verbs, it's so default that the direct object is the subject, we typically don't say the direct object every single time. The other person will still know what's going on. They'll know that Jimmy sits in a chair, missing direct object, really means Jimmy sits himself in a chair, no missing direct object, because that's the default. When we sit ourselves. This is another example of default context. In English, when the verb is a bodily movement verb, we almost always omit the direct object, but not always. I remember teachers telling me all the time, Jordan, you sit yourself in that chair right now. They said you sit yourself. We don't always omit the direct object with bodily movement verbs in English, just almost always. And we wonder why in Spanish, Jimmy sits in a chair is translated as Jimmy se sienta en una silla, which is the equivalent of Jimmy sits himself in a chair. Well, this is why. In English, we usually omit the direct object with to sit. Jimmy se sienta en una silla. The subject is Jimmy, the verb is sienta, from sentar, which means to sit. The direct object is se. In this example, se means himself. Then en una silla is a prepositional object phrase. It means in a seat. Oh, this is our first example with se. Remember, except sometimes when it's part of a double object pronoun, se tells us this sentence refers back to the subject at some point in some way. Well, when the verb is a bodily movement verb, se specifically tells us this sentence refers back to the subject at the direct object. With bodily movement verbs, se is the direct object. Again, in this example, se means himself. I call this the language of reality. When a sentence is missing context, that's not reality. But when we fill in the missing context, we make it so the words of the sentence do match reality. What's cool is when we rewrite English and Spanish sentences in the language of reality, not only do we make the sentences match reality, we make them match each other. Jimmy sits in a chair. That's missing context. It doesn't match reality. And it doesn't match the Spanish either. Jimmy se sienta en una silla. They say the direct object, we don't. But once we fill in the missing direct object, once we rewrite the English sentence in the language of reality, Jimmy sits himself in a chair, not only does that match reality word for word, it matches the Spanish translation word for word. Cool, right? Another verb that's commonly used as a bodily movement verb is to go. This is gonna seem weird at first, but just remember, when we're used to something, it seems normal or right, and when we're not used to something, it seems weird or wrong. In reality, when we go somewhere, all we have to do is move our bodies. We just need to take ourselves there. When we go, we do the verb to ourselves. We do the going, we're the subject, and we get the going done to us, we're the direct object. Sure, these days we usually take a bike, car, bus, train, or airplane to go most places, but we don't have to, we're just lazy. Just kidding. But technically, we could walk or swim to any location on planet Earth. It's just not practical most of the time, and we die on the way to most places. Jimmy goes to the beach. The subject is Jimmy, the verb is goes, then to the beach is a prepositional object phrase. This sentence is missing its direct object. That's because, in this example, goes is being used as a bodily movement verb, and with bodily movement verbs, it's so default that the direct object is the subject, we typically omit the direct object. But in the language of reality, Jimmy goes to the beach, missing direct object, means Jimmy himself goes to the beach, no missing direct object. Or Jimmy goes himself to the beach, still no missing direct object. Neither of these translations are necessarily telling us that Jimmy goes to the beach all alone, though they could be saying that too. All we know for sure is Jimmy personally goes to the beach, or Jimmy goes personally to the beach. Like, Jimmy went to the beach? No way. I can't believe that. He must have sent somebody in his place. No sirree, Bob. Jimmy himself went to the beach. Jimmy went himself to the beach. And again, we wonder why in Spanish, Jimmy goes to the beach is often translated as Jimmy se va a la playa, the equivalent of Jimmy himself goes to the beach, or Jimmy goes himself to the beach. But really, the better question is, why don't we say himself in English? That's what matches reality better. In this sentence, the subject is Jimmy, the verb is ba, from ear, the direct object is se. In this case, it again means himself. Remember, with bodily movement verbs, se tells us specifically the clause or sentence refers refers back to the subject at the direct object. With bodily movement verbs, se is the direct object. We do bodily movement verbs to ourselves. Now, you will also see Jimmy goes to the beach translated as just Jimmy va a la playa without se. But when you do, that just means they omitted the direct object in Spanish like we do in English. They omitted se. In English, with the verb to go, we almost always omit the direct object. In Spanish, with the verb ir, sometimes they omit the direct object, sometimes they don't. This example shows us how hard it can be sometimes to differentiate between the words in a sentence and what's actually happening in reality. We're so used to talking the way we talk, until we go to learn a second language, we don't even realize there is a difference between the words in a sentence and reality. Okay, now existential verbs. Same thing basically. Existential verbs are verbs we do to ourselves, and to do an existential verb, we don't need to involve anything else or anybody else, we just need ourselves. The difference is, to do an existential verb, we don't even have to move. The prototypical existential verb is to be. This one is probably going to sound even weirder than the example with to go did. When we do the verb to be, we do the being, where the subject, and we get the being done to us, where the direct object. It's an existential thing. For example, Jimmy is happy. The subject is Jimmy, the verb is, which comes from to be, then happy is an adjective. This sentence is missing its direct object. But Jimmy is a person, right? And no matter what happens, Jimmy will always be a person. It's an existential thing. So Jimmy is happy, missing direct object, really means Jimmy is a happy person. Yay for Jimmy, and yay for us. No more missing direct object. The direct object is person, or a happy person, which is an article and an adjective attached to a noun. The thing is, it's just so default that with existential verbs, the direct object is the subject. We don't have to say the direct object every single time. The other person will still know what's going on. Now, if Jimmy is actually a dog, that changes everything and nothing. If Jimmy's a dog, then Jimmy will always be a dog, won't he? Again, it's an existential thing. In that case, Jimmy is happy would really mean Jimmy is a happy dog. Now the direct object is dog or a happy dog. I like dogs. Another verb that's commonly used as an existential verb is to seem or to seem to be. It's the same verb, we just use it differently depending on the context. Jimmy seems sad and Jimmy seems to be sad both mean the same thing, and they're both missing their direct objects. But Jimmy is still a person, isn't he? Jimmy will always be a person. So Jimmy seems sad or Jimmy seems to be sad, missing direct object, really mean Jimmy seems to be a sad person. No missing direct object. The direct object is person or a sad person. With existential verbs, we usually omit the direct object because duh, with existential verbs, the direct object is the subject. After bodily movement verbs and existential verbs, most missing direct objects are caused by an ad hoc, random collection of verbs. The reason we omit the direct object is different for each verb. It depends on the logic of that particular verb. For example, when we use the verbs to cry, to cough, and to sneeze, we usually omit the direct object because it's so default that when we cry tears, that when we cough coughs, and that when we sneeze sneezes. We don't have to say tears, cough, and sneeze every single time. The other person will still know what's going on. Unless the context tells us otherwise, Jimmy cried last night, missing direct object, really means Jimmy cried tears last night, no missing direct object. Jimmy coughed in Kimmy's face, missing direct object, really means Jimmy coughed a cough in Kimmy's face, no missing direct object. Not cool, Jimmy. Then Kimmy sneezed in Jimmy's face, missing direct object, really means Kimmy sneezed a sneeze in Jimmy's face, no missing direct object. Nice, Kimmy. As the late great Gorilla Monsoon would say, churnabout is fair play. But we don't always omit the direct object with these verbs. Jimmy cried tears of joy last night. That's something we'd say. Not to mention, in real life, we talk about tears, coughs, and sneezes all the time. So if we don't cry tears, cough coughs, and sneeze sneezes, where do all those tears, coughs, and sneezes come from? Are you starting to see what I see? In reality, for every verb, there's a subject and a direct object. It doesn't matter which language we're using. It doesn't matter if the subject or direct object has been omitted from the sentence. In the real world, once a verb is involved, there's always a subject and there's always a direct object, which is why I say the terms transitive and intransitive have zero relation to reality. In reality, if there's always a direct object, intransitive verbs can't really be a thing. Now, I wish I could tell you the saga ends here, but I can't. It doesn't. You know how one lie often leads to another? We tell one lie, then to make that one lie work, we have to tell another lie, then another? Well, once the Spanish authority tells us that intransitive verbs are a thing, that sometimes the direct object just disappears into thin air, to make that work with everything else they tell us and everything else we see, they make up some real whoppers. If you and I are driving down the street and you see a house you like, you could point to the house and say any of these 4 sentences. That house is a pretty house. That is a pretty house. That house is pretty. That is pretty. Since you could say all 4 of these sentences in exactly the same situation, that means in this context, they all mean the same thing. They all describe the same reality, just with slightly different words. Because of the way the nomenclature works though, in the first and third sentences, the word that is considered a demonstrative adjective, or as I say, a demonstrative adjective. But in the second and fourth sentences, the word that is considered a demonstrative pronoun. So when there's a noun after the word that is an adjective, and when there's not a noun after the word that is a pronoun. Even though the situation in reality hasn't changed, only the words in the sentences have changed. Okay, so I assume the same thing happens with the word pretty in the first and second sentences. Since pretty has a noun after it, it's considered an adjective? Yep. Then in the third and fourth sentences, since the word pretty doesn't have a noun after it, it's considered a pronoun? Nope, sorry. In all 4 of these sentences, the word pretty is considered an adjective. Now, you and I know, in both cases, just because the noun was omitted from the sentence, that doesn't mean the noun magically disappeared in real life. In Spanish, though, because of the whole adjective matching thing, the fact that adjectives have different forms sometimes to match the noun they're attached to in both gender and number, the reality of the situation is even more apparent. In Spanish, that house is a pretty house, a house is always a house, would be esa casa es una casa bonita. It's esa and bonita to match casa, a singular feminine noun, la casa. But as long as we're still talking about a house, just that is pretty would be esa es bonita. It's still esa and bonita to match casa, even though the word casa isn't even in the sentence anymore. That's because it's still there in reality. And that book is a good book would be ese libro es un libro bueno. Now it's ese and bueno to match libro, a singular masculine noun, el libro. But as long as we're still talking about a book, just that is good would be ese es bueno. It's still ese and bueno to match libro, even though libro isn't in the sentence anymore. Because books don't just magically disappear. The book is still there in reality. Unlike the stuff with lo, se, and the subjunctive, unlike the transitive intransitive thing, this inconsistent nomenclature isn't the end of the world. This doesn't really screw us up that much. We do the same thing in both languages, and for some reason our brains handle it okay. But no, wait, that house is pretty. If there's no direct object, not in the sentence and not in reality, and the word pretty is still an adjective, and adjectives are words that tell us more about nouns, where's the noun that pretty tells us more about? Hold that thought. Check out this example. I came across this late one night when I was in the grammar hole. I'll show you what's behind those black boxes in a minute. The shoes look expensive. The subject is the shoes, the verb is look, then expensive is an adjective. This sentence is missing its direct object. And that's because the verb look, from to look, isn't being used the normal way here. Normally, when we look at something, we see it with our eyes. But in this sentence, the shoes aren't looking at anything. The verb to look is being used as an existential verb. This is similar to the example from before with the verb to seem or to seem to be. Remember, Jimmy seems happy and Jimmy seems to be happy, missing direct object. Both really mean Jimmy seems to be a happy person. No missing direct object? Well, now the shoes look expensive is the same thing as the shoes look to be expensive, missing direct object in both. But shoes are always shoes, right? So both these sentences really mean the shoes look to be expensive shoes. No missing direct object. The subject is the shoes, the verb is looks to be, the direct object is expensive shoes. So in my world, the same thing happens no matter what. It doesn't matter if the speaker omits the direct object or doesn't omit the direct object. The subject always does the verb to the direct object. In this example, the adjective expensive always tells us more about the direct object, even when the direct object is missing from the sentence. That's not how the Spanish authority sees things though. Oh no, the shoes look expensive. In their world, there's simply no direct object, not in the sentence, not in reality. But that brings us back to the question from a few minutes ago. If there's no direct object and expensive is still an adjective, and adjectives are words that tell us more about nouns, where's the noun that expensive tells us more about? I now remove the first black box. This big arrow down here that says modifies, that's the Spanish authority telling us in this sentence the adjective expensive actually modifies the subject. Okay, that's kinda true, but only because the subject is shoes and the direct object is also shoes, even though the direct object has been omitted. Let's keep going. I now remove the second black box. They're oddly calling expensive a predicate adjective now. I've never heard of a predicate adjective before, or I subconsciously blocked it out because it's utterly worthless. When talking about grammar, the predicate of a sentence is everything in the sentence that's not part of the subject. I never understood the point of that term. What does it tell us? But right now the point is, expensive is clearly not part of the subject here, so duh, it's a predicate adjective? What's weird is, calling expensive a predicate adjective, an adjective that's not part of the subject, directly contradicts what they tell us down here with the arrow, that the adjective expensive modifies the subject. So according to them, the predicate adjective, the adjective that's not part of the subject, modifies the subject? They're so weird. Let's remove the last black box now. Oh, I see. The predicate adjective expensive, the adjective that's not part of the subject, actually modifies the subject because the verb look is a magical linking verb, of which I've also never heard of or again subconsciously blocked out. It's not that the speaker simply omitted the direct object from the sentence knowing the other person would still understand them, because that's how it works with existential verbs. Oh no, 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 no. It's because look is now suddenly a special linking verb with special linking powers. Wow. Just wow. Could it be more convoluted? Then, for the record, when the adjective expensive is part of the subject, so the expensive shoes, it's suddenly an attributive adjective, not a predicate adjective. Or maybe they're saying whenever the adjective is attached to the noun, it's an attributive adjective. It doesn't matter. Either way, it's just more delusion. The Spanish authority is straight up dishonest, or they're delusional. I don't see a way around that. I know I've been making up terms too, but I don't claim that bodily movement verbs or existential verbs have special powers in some sentences, but not in others. In fact, it's the exact opposite. I only made up those terms in the first place so it'd be easier for you to see why we tend to omit the direct object when using a verb in those two groups. To make it easier for you to see that no matter what happens in the sentence, the same thing happens in reality. The subject does the verb to the direct object. No inconsistent nomenclature, no convoluted nomenclature, no magic. This all reminds me of a physics video I saw on YouTube recently. I guess when asked the question, when we roll a ball, why does the ball eventually stop rolling? Aristotle would have answered, because the ball gets tired. And people believed that for thousands of years, until Isaac Newton came along and showed us that an object in motion stays in motion with the same speed and in the same direction unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. With the ball, I think that unbalanced force is friction. Now, I don't mean to compare myself to Isaac Newton here, but I most certainly do intend to compare the Spanish authority to Aristotle. In their world, balls stop rolling because they get tired. Nouns just magically disappear. And when the nouns disappear, all the other words in a sentence suddenly become transformers.